Hi guys, bit of a wet drizzle. Hopefully I don't get too soaked. Just a quick overview of how to use a basic 35mm SLR camera. Take the lens cap off. This is a Ricoh KR5 Super, but it's very much like most 35mm cameras of this era. This was purchased for me when I was in high school in the early 80s by my parents. Just a basic SLR. So yeah, that was my first attempt at recording this video, and as I started recording I started realizing that I probably needed a couple of things to do this video the way I wanted to, but I recorded anyway, and then this happened. And I'm getting soaked. So now I'm doing this from my office, and hopefully I'll get through it in one shot. So basically, I just wanted to go over some of the basics of using a very simple basic SLR film camera. One of the first things I wanted to do was show you how the SLR works, just the basic functions. Again, this is part of a series of videos that I'm doing aimed at people who maybe have never used a camera before, so that they get the absolute basics. So if you're experienced with cameras and maybe stuff here you already know, that stuff's not intended for you. So this is a very simple SLR film camera. SLR, what does it stand for? It stands for single lens reflex. If you remember my earlier video where I showed you how to use the Contina Zeiss Icon camera, that was a vintage 35mm camera. It had the main lens you look through, but it actually had a little separate lens up here for the viewfinder. This has a single lens on the front. That's why they're calling it a single lens reflex. The reflex part is because inside here, if you take the lens off, there's a mirror inside here. How that works is when the light comes in through the lens, it hits the mirror, and the mirror is at a 45-degree angle. It reflects the light up onto a focusing screen up here, which is a kind of an opaque sheet of glass or plastic. And then when you look through the viewfinder, you're looking through a prism so that you're seeing the image that's projected onto the focusing screen. That way, when you're focusing the lens, you're actually seeing what's coming through the lens. That's different from the separate viewfinder, rangefinder type cameras where you're looking through a separate lens and not the actual lens that's capturing the image. What happens when you take a picture with a camera like this is when you push the shutter, the mirror flips out of the way, and then the shutter opens and closes. The shutter opens for whatever you have the shutter speed set to and allows the light to hit the film. The distance for the light coming through the lens hitting the mirror onto the focusing screen is exactly the same as the distance when the mirror is out of the way for it to hit the film. That's why you can focus accurately using the focusing screen. I will open this camera because I don't have film in it. I'll show you. I've got it set on B so I can hold the shutter open. If you look, you can see a little bit of light on the mirror. So when I push this button, the mirror flips up and the shutter opens. That would allow the light to hit the film. I've got the back open so you can see me through the hole. When I let go of the button, or when the shutter closes, when it's set to something other than B, the shutter closes, the mirror drops back down, and then you can see through the viewfinder. Looking from the other side, I will wind it and reset the camera. Same thing, if the back is closed and the film is here, you take a picture, it opens, and then it closes. That's the basic function of how the mirror works, the shutter works inside. The next thing is how to load the film in one of these. I actually covered that in a previous video, so I will include that segment right now rather than re-recording it. I'll include that part from the earlier video now. With every camera, there's really a button here, or there's different ways of opening it. On this camera, you pull up the rewind spool, the back opens. What you do then is the film canister just fits into here, and then you pull out just enough film to tuck it into a slot on the rewind spool. So you'll see I've tucked it into a slot on here, and then you just start to wind this, And once you get the film started and you know it's hooked on, you don't want to do too much. You don't want to pull it on too far. You just go in here and you pull it a little bit until you get snug, and then you close the door, push this, and on this camera, you can see, if you look at this spool, you'll see this side turns as I pull the winding lever. So what you do is you take a couple of pictures. And the reason I took a couple of pictures like that is to get the camera ready, because when you're winding it on, the film that's sitting in front of the shutter plus a little bit on this side has already been exposed to light, so it's no good for taking pictures. So what you want to do is push the button, wind it, push the button again to make sure you have fresh film in front of the shutter so you're ready to take a picture. This camera has a small counter right here that shows you how many pictures you've taken. So it's not even at 1 yet, because it is allowing for the fact that I need to do a couple of shots to even get the camera loaded up. So now at this point, the camera is ready to take pictures, except for one little detail. And what you would need to do on this camera to calibrate the internal lighting meter is there's a dial on here that you would need to turn to, in the case of this film, to ISO 100. And now, assuming the battery is fresh in this, which it probably isn't in this case, this camera would be ready with the lens on it to be able to take pictures. Now that you have film loaded in the camera and you've set the dial here for the correct ISO of film, currently this camera actually has film in it. It is actually ISO 400 color negative film, so it's made for color prints. So that means that the light meter inside is calibrated for ISO 400 film. So first thing, using the camera, take the lens cap off. So this camera has a built-in internal light meter for setting the exposure. And a lot of the older cameras do have them, some of them don't. If you end up with a camera that doesn't have an internal light meter, or the light meter doesn't work, you can use an external light meter like I showed in my earlier video. You can also use an app on your phone. Both will work well as long as you set them to the right ISO of film. It'll give you the same settings, and you can use it that way. However, this camera does have an internal meter. It's very easy to use. This camera only has 3 settings to adjust for taking a picture, just like that other camera that I was showing you. There's the aperture, which is a ring on the lens. There's the shutter speed, which is up here. And then you've got the focus on the lens here. So the first thing you want to do is set the exposure for when you're taking a picture. In this camera, not all cameras work this way, but on this camera, to turn the camera on, you flip this lever up to this position. It's the rewind lever. So if you pull it up like this and it stops, that means the film is already wound, ready for a picture. You just pull it up here. That unlocks the shutter button, because if this is down, the shutter button will not work on this camera. Moving it up like this also turns the light meter on. In this camera, the light meter consists of 2 needles, two indicators inside when you look in the viewfinder. And they're on the right side when you look in. And there are 2 needles in there. One of them just a straight one, and it moves up and down by the amount of light coming in through the lens and by where you set the aperture ring. So if you look through the camera like this and turn the aperture ring, as you go to a more open aperture or a lower f-stop, the needle moves up. If you close down the lens, the needle moves down. It's just indicating the amount of light that's going to be hitting the film. There's a second needle in there, and this camera, it has a little loop on the end of it, and that moves up and down with the shutter speed. As you go to a faster shutter speed, the needle moves up, and as you move to a slower shutter speed, it goes down. In this camera, when the 2 needles line up, that's indicating a correct exposure for the film speed you have set on here. So what I could do is, for example, I could go and set this to, if let's say I want to use 125th of a second shutter speed, I could go to here, look through here, move this until I get the other needle, the aperture needle, to line up with the shutter speed needle. Similarly, if I want to pre-select an aperture reading for some reason, I can do that and then move the shutter speed indicator until it lines up. Once they line up, You should have the correct exposure. Remember that especially with color print film, sometimes to be safe, it's okay to overexpose just a little bit. So if your aperture needle is just slightly above the other one, you're probably fine. It might actually work better for some pictures where there's a lot of shadows so that things don't get lost in the shadows. Once you have the exposure set correctly, you look through the camera, look at your subject, and you can move the focus ring till it's in focus. Now, on the focus screen, you can see the whole image and you just look until it looks sharp. But also in this camera and many cameras, there's an additional aid in the center of the focus screen, which is a small circle with a split line, either diagonal or horizontal or vertical. And what that does is if you find a continuous line or an edge on your subject, you line that line up on there, and in the split image, it will kind of cut the line off, and you turn the focus until the two lines are continuous again, and that'll indicate that it's in proper focus. Sometimes it's really hard to tell exactly if something is in focus just by looking at the focus screen, but that split screen in the middle is an additional aid to make sure that things are in focus. Now, just remember a couple of things when you go to take a picture with one of these. For example, this camera, if you go to take a picture and push the button and nothing happens, you have to make sure, did you wind the film first? If you haven't wound it to the next picture, it's not going to work. If it's not turned on, it's not going to work on this. Some cameras, like a Pentax K1000, don't have this on and off function in the lever. They will just take a picture. Also with the Pentax K1000, the exposure meter works a little bit differently inside. It has a single needle, and it's got like a plus at the top and a minus at the bottom. What you do is when you have the correct combination of shutter and aperture, the needle will be roughly horizontal in the middle. If you open up the aperture too far or slow down the shutter speed too much, it will go up. And if you are underexposing, in other words, you're using too fast of a shutter speed or too small of an aperture, the needle will point down. So you find a combination that keeps it in the middle. Again, really easy to use. Some ways simpler than this. I like the dual needle setup, but both of them are really simple to use. Different cameras will have a different setup, but when you get your camera, you'll just need to figure out how that works, but it will always be a combination of shutter speed and aperture that gives you the proper exposure. One of the things I like about this camera is that it is completely manual. The only reason it needs a battery is for the meter to work. If the battery's dead, the camera still functions. Otherwise, you just don't have the internal meter functioning. If you get a camera that has more functions on it, requires the battery for the shutter to function, things like that, there's also more to go wrong. They may be a nicer camera to use, but when you're dealing with vintage, older cameras, that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at them. Sometimes simpler is better. One of the big advantages of SLRs over a lot of the older style cameras or the rangefinder cameras is the ease of switching between lenses and still being able to see how your image is composed. Lenses come in two main styles. This would be considered what is called a prime lens because it is one focal length. This one happens to be 135 millimeters. It's not a super powerful, but it's a telephoto lens. The normal kit lenses on most of these cameras would have been 50 or 55 millimeters, which is considered kind of a standard lens. Anything with a shorter focal length than that is considered a wide-angle lens. Longer than that is considered a telephoto lens. Prime lenses are just a single focal length. Whatever that focal length is, that's all they are. The other option you have, of course, is a zoom lens. A zoom lens allows you to vary the focal length of the lens. So this lens goes from 28 millimeters to 70 millimeters. 28 is a wide angle, 70 is a mild telephoto. On this lens, the way it works is there's still an aperture ring, just like the other one. There's a focus ring out here, but there's an additional ring here for zooming. So when I go to here, I'm at 70 millimeter focal length. When I go to here, it's a 28 millimeter focal length. So if you were looking through the viewfinder, you would see things zoom in and out as you turn this ring. Using this lens is exactly the same as the other one. You set your aperture first. You might want to adjust your zoom and then your focus to frame your shot. Sometimes zooming in tight and then focusing and then zooming back out will help you focus. You have to be careful because some lenses don't stay in focus throughout their zoom range. Some do. You'll need to check with your lens to see how it works. This is a fairly common design of zoom lens. The third type of lens, which was really common before autofocus lenses came out, was this one. This is a 70 to 210 millimeter zoom. It has an aperture ring here, just like the other lenses that I showed you. This is the focus ring, but it's also the zoom. So turning it causes it to focus. At this position out here, it is at 70 millimeter focal length. When I move it in here, it's at 210 millimeter focal length. So prior to having autofocus lenses, I really liked using these lenses because I could be looking through my camera and I could focus and zoom without taking my hand off the ring and trying to fumble around with it. So they were very convenient for that and the fastest way to focus on moving objects prior to having autofocus. Those are the three main designs of lenses, if you want to call them that. When you buy a camera, you'll want to choose your camera brand by the type of lenses you want on them. My cameras use Pentax key mount lenses. All of these lenses are designed to mount onto a Pentax key mount. So Ricoh uses that, Pentax uses them. There's a couple of other brands that used the same type of a mount. If you go to buy a Canon camera, you will need to buy lenses that are compatible with the Canon camera. The same thing with a Nikon. If you buy a Nikon, you need to have lenses that are compatible with a Nikon. Sometimes a deciding factor on the brand of camera might be if you have a family member that already has some lenses that you have some access to, you might want to get a camera that matches those lenses. Because overall, when you're buying cameras, the lenses end up being the more expensive part of the equation, not the camera body. These old film cameras are very inexpensive to buy. The lenses are not crazy priced right now, but they generally cost more than the camera itself. When you're looking at vintage cameras, you can get cameras like I've mentioned here that are very basic. There's no automatic anything in them. As you move through the price range of the cameras, the original price ranges, as you got to a little bit newer cameras, things like autofocus and auto aperture and things like that were introduced. So you might want to look at one of those. They are faster for taking pictures. The issue, of course, is that the more complex that vintage camera is, the more likely it is for things to be going wrong with it, and the more difficult it might be to repair. Also, anything beyond the complexity of these cameras often rely on batteries for the camera to function. So cameras that generally have a faster shutter speed, the shutters end up being more than just a spring wound shutter. You need batteries to make the camera function to take pictures at all. So again, there's more to go wrong with them. So sometimes it's a good idea to just keep it simple when you're looking at the cameras. Also, if you're looking at buying a used camera, go through it and test it. Make sure the shutter is moving cleanly. When you open it up and look inside, make sure that the mirror moves up and down freely and doesn't get hung up. Make sure that the viewfinder is clear and that you're able to focus when you put a lens on it. Another thing that happens with these cameras is there are light seals at the top here, and depending on the design of the camera, there might be light seals on the back. But the light seals at the top are important because what happens is when the mirror comes up, the mirror also blocks the light that's coming in through the viewfinder from getting down onto the film while the shutter's open. If these light seals start to degrade and crumble, they're just foam. If they start to crumble and fall apart, what can happen is if you're taking a picture, while the mirror is up, light is leaking in through the viewfinder and going down and spoiling your image because there's extra light getting onto the film in addition to the light that's coming through the lens. So those light seals can be replaced inexpensively. A lot of people do it themselves. There's a lot of YouTube videos showing you how to do that, but it's something to be aware of. Take a look at them. Look at it and see, do the light seals appear to be good? They're just foam. If there's chunks missing, it might be a problem. You might have to replace them. Make sure the shutter moves freely. Make sure when you open it up, take a look through the back of the camera. Make sure that everything looks clean. And when you operate it, make sure that the shutter moves freely. Try different shutter speeds. And you should be able to tell at a faster shutter speed that it's much faster. If it's getting hung up or slow, there's a problem with the camera. So just have a look at all of that and make sure it seems to be working okay. And just have fun with them. These 35mm cameras nowadays, some of the really old nice cameras can be bought for a really good price, and they're a really good way to learn more about photography. Anyway, hopefully this is helpful to somebody. If you like the video, click the like button. If you want to see more, subscribe, and see you next time. Thanks.